Chapter 13 and this week's lecture are both on emerging topics in information security. The textbook is, of course, a little bit older than these slides, and so it's covering a few things in a little bit different light than I will be covering them in this lecture. I'm hoping to update what's in the textbook and also add some things to what is presented in the textbook. Just as a quick overview of some of our objectives, we're going to look at organizational approaches to security, primarily through the Besom, although there are other alternatives to that. I think the Besom is a good one, and it's a nice introduction to that approach to security. Then we're going to look at the Internet of Things. This is, again, more stuff that I'm adding to what's available in the textbook. We'll talk a little bit about Bitcoin, some financial measures of cybersecurity. These are important for a variety of reasons, but all three of those have been in the news quite consistently over the last several years. Then we're going to look at electronic voting, which has taken on a new interest this particular year, since this is an election year, although many of the problems in electronic voting are very, very old. And then we'll look at examples of cyber warfare and the policy implications of the internet for warfare. All right, let's start with the Besom, though. Besom stands for Building Security in Maturity Model, and it is comparable to a maturity model in software engineering called the Capability Maturity Model, which is essentially an attempt to measure the maturity of your process for building software systems. Basically, how good are you at software engineering? Besom is very similar to that, except with security, because security really should be thought of as a process. It is not a single tool. It is not a single technique. It is not just crypto. It is an entire process to building and maintaining software so that it is as secure as it can possibly be. So we need measures for processes. We need measures for organizations. It started out very simply as a way to study existing software security initiatives and figure out what common practices were. So in Besom 10, the most recent version of the Besom, there were 122 firms in multiple vertical markets, and this was a longitudinal study over quite some time. The Besom is structured across 4 domains: governance, intelligence, secure development lifecycle processes, and deployment. You can kind of think of deployment as both deployment and maintenance. And it is a little bit strange to see secure development lifecycle as one of the domains when in reality the entire Besom is sort of looking at the whole process of building secure software. So I think of those, that's the one that's the least coherent as a concept as one of the domains. Now we're going to walk through some examples of each of these 4 domains in the next few slides. First, we're going to do governance. This is the first of the 4. There are 3 so-called practices here: strategy and metrics, compliance and policy, and then training. And underneath each of these are just a couple of the example activities that are described by these Besom to give you a sense of what the Besom is really all about. So under compliance and policy in the governance domain, some of the things that you would look for in an organization to measure their maturity are, do they have some way of unifying all of the regulatory pressures? So one example of this might be in a university setting, you have to comply with privacy laws for FERPA, right? Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. You also have to comply with HIPAA for healthcare information. And those are different laws that have sometimes conflicting concerns. And then finally, you might have to comply with something like GLBA or other financial regulations. Making sure that you have a coherent approach to all of your regulatory obligations is a critical piece of making good, strong, secure software. Another good example of this would be a positive piece of this process that imposes policies on vendors. So for example, if you know that you have to comply with HIPAA, you wouldn't work with an organization that would not also sign a business associates agreement, which is essentially a contract that transfers liability to them to make sure that they are aware of the policy and that they will comply with the policy. I'm not going to go through each of the activities. I think if you're interested in those, you can download the Besom at the blue link on the previous slide and go through each of the activities. But I do want to give you a sense of the flavor for each of the 4 domains of the kinds of activities that you will see. All right, intelligence is the second of the 4 domains. Again, 3 practices and some example activities. The practices are the attack models, right? You want to make sure that there's some understanding of an attack, or at least the patterns that are commonly used in attacks. And then the second of these practices is security features and design. You have to have some notion of what the security features are and how they need to be designed into the software system. In this particular case, one of the activities is requiring the use of some kind of an approved security feature and framework as part of the SDLC. So if there is a common process and there is a known good way of doing it, then that's the way you have to do it in your organization. Finally, standards and requirements, the last practice here. Standards are really important for software development, and they can't be any more, I can't stress these enough for security purposes. Most of the time, standards have been designed very carefully to address things that organizations would otherwise not be aware of, right? So using good crypto algorithms basically translates to finding the standard crypto algorithm that everyone is using for these kinds of problems and then deploying it in your own organization. Secure coding standards are very similar. If you have a part of your continuous integration process that uses some kind of a static analysis engine to ensure that you're following good secure coding standards practices, that would be a nice feather in your cap for this last practice in the Besom, or for the second practice in the Besom. The third one is the secure development lifecycle, and this is the one that I think is a little bit odd because it is a little bit I don't know, almost recursive, right? The whole Besom is supposed to look at the process of building secure software, and this is actually where the rubber meets the road, where you start integrating the secure development into your software development lifecycle. And they have, of course, 3 practices and a couple of example activities here as well. Architecture analysis, you have to have some kind of a feature review for security concerns. Code review as a part of your process. Do you have a code review process? Does it include security concerns? Most of the time, this can be partially automated with some of the static analysis tools that are available now, which are generally very good depending on the language that you're working in. And security testing. Do you actually have a security testing process? Is it part of your QA? Is it automated? Do you have a feedback lifecycle that this information gets translated not just as a correction to the code, but also as a lesson for the developers back to the people who actually built the part of the system that may have failed a security test? The fourth practice is deployment, which is really deployment and maintenance. And this is, again, 3 practices. There are 3 practices within this domain and some sample activities. Penetration testing, I think, is a really important way of identifying security concerns, and not every organization is going to have enough to pay for like a full-time red team, but you should at least schedule some sort of periodic penetration test for the application, the live application on your system. And this SSG, this is something that the Besom talks about quite a lot, the Secure Software Group. Essentially a group of people who understand security and are willing to move from one organization or one part of your organization to another part of your organization to highlight the security concerns within each of these modules. If you do have this group of security experts, then they should really be the ones that are doing the penetration testing, or at least customizing the tools and scripts for your particular environment so that you can verify that you've got at least reasonable security practices on your live software system. The software environment itself, can you actually provide installation guidance to the people who are trying to set up the environment? This could apply both to the live environment, the production environment, as well as the development environment, because again, you want your development environment to be secure as well. Configuration management, vulnerability management. Essentially, when there are vulnerabilities out in the wild, does your organization have a way to incorporate those changes into your process, right? This is essentially the problem with the Equifax bug, right? Equifax basically failed at this last step here. All right, so the last piece of the Besom that I wanted to show is a spider chart. This is an example just from Besom 6. It's an older version of the Besom. Not a particularly critical piece. I wanted to show this for a couple of reasons. First, it's a good demonstration of how you can compare an organization with another organization using a visualization. So this is a spider chart for the governance domain, and you can see the practices here. There's 12 for each of the domains, and then within them activities that would, as you add them up, give you a score from 0.0 all the way to 3.0. And this is one way that you could compare things, because if you order these practices exactly the same around this spider chart, then 2 organizations, you could just overlay them and you'd see very quickly which one is really good at having nice policies for compliance, but maybe struggling in incorporating attack models into their governance process. Or maybe one is really good at using standards and requirements and not quite as good at code reviews, right? So these are things that you want to compare across organizations, especially if you are at an organization you want to compare with what happens in sort of like the average aggregate median type organization. That's very important from a regulatory compliance standard, regulatory compliance process, because one of the standards is, are you doing something that is wildly out of step with the rest of the industry? Second, I wanted to at least mention that one of the main problems with spider charts really is this ordering. I had kind of said it as a brief aside that if you order these in exactly the same way, then they're very easy to compare from one organization to another. Not only does it become problematic to compare if you've moved the compliance and policy part from this, like, I don't know, 1 o'clock position to, some other position on the spider chart. It also makes the area inside of this curve very, very different. So you could actually order this in such a way that the area would be maximized, and then another such a way that the area would be minimized. So to maximize it, you would sort of like alternate a really low value with a really high value. To like minimize it, you'd alternate a really low value with a really high value, and then to maximize it, you'd try and have like this nice gradient where you start low and then get high by the end, just to get as much volume inside of this curve as you could. It's not easy to come up with a good visualization to compare this kind of a metric, and I think the spider chart is in some ways a little bit misleading, but if you have the same order, exactly the same order, and you're not interested in area under the curve, you're really just interested in finding the relative differences, a spider chart can work very, very well. So that's everything I wanted to say about the Besom. There's quite a bit more to be said. It's got a very long history now. I think they've been doing this for 12 years now, something like that. It's got a fairly long history, and there are comparable processes for trying to measure how secure an organization is, but the Besom, in my mind, seems like the gold standard. It's got a very good process behind it. It's not an academic enterprise, but it's intended to be used in a consulting role. And of course, if you end up working for a security consulting firm other than the ones that are working with Besom, you'll have to learn a new or different approach to this, but all the basics will still be the same. You'll still be looking to see how can we measure the process that people have in place for security at their organization.